Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Not Content Podcast. Typically, what we do is we have been celebrating a number of anniversaries this summer. Brian and I have spent a number of weeks talking about movies such as Team America from last week, as well as Dick. We have Doctor Strange Love still to come, and we've got surprises along the way, including a number of important Jim Carrey movie anniversaries as well. So make sure that you are checking that out. But we are taking a break from that today. Ben Phillips is back. We are going to be continuing our discussion of 62 animated Disney movies. We did the first 21 a few months ago. Now we are going to do our next 21. And this episode, I have a feeling, is going to be a little bit longer. There's a lot more. This is the greatest disparity in terms of our lists, this middle portion. So it's going to be a fun conversation. A little bit of a recap from last month, or 3 months ago at this point. We spent a lot of time talking about some of the packaged Disney movies that came out during World War II as they tried to keep the doors open. We talked about some pretty mediocre to bad movies. We objectively have decided that Chicken Little is the worst Disney movie ever made. We also talked about, some mediocrity from the early 2000s. One of the dinosaur movies Disney has produced that people have forgotten about, and the very disappointing Wish. So this month is going to take us in a number of other different directions. We'll be talking about some favorites, some classics even, that did not quite make our cut as far as being the top 20 Disney movies of all time. Again, please hit the like button on YouTube. Please leave a 4 or 5 star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so people can discover the show. Ben, with all of that very long introduction being said, how are you?
I'm good. It's very hot in the UK at the moment, but I feel like that's just climate change and the fact that we are a country uniquely decided to basically not facilitate the heat in any way. Yeah, but how are you, Jerome?
I think our countries are on a real race to becoming fascist, and I feel like we took a big lead this weekend that may be very hard to overcome. So I'm feeling really good about that. I feel like I want to win this race, got to beat the Brits again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk about the election. I've already spent enough time talking about the election in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, you're telling me. Look
either
who you're
election,
talking to.
Either election, the US, UK, even France. I'm just sick and tired of talking about the elections that are happening across most of the world. So I'm very excited to dive into children classic
and by
movies.
dive in, you mean completely disassociate and talk about something else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the fun portion of the list because this has got movies that I love, movies that you love, and then also movies that I dislike and movies that you dislike, and sometimes there's mismatch in which orders those go in.
It's really fascinating. One thing I will say, I don't think dislike is quite the term that I would use, because for me, anything above at this point to me on Letterboxd, I've given it 3 stars or above. So I would not say that I dislike any of these movies. I would just say that our passions tend to run in very different circles with many of the movies that are on this portion of the list. So I would say hate is a very strong word. Like, hate to me, I reserve hate for things like Chicken Little and Home on the Range, which are grossly offensive. I think any of the movies on this list, I think they are varying degrees of quality. They all have their positives, but for me, some of them didn't hit, and for some of you, for you, some of them didn't hit in different ways. So
yeah, I think that the range for me is basically like there's a few 2.5 stars, and there's even some like 4.5 stars, and everything else is kind of in that like 3 star, kind of 3.5 star level in this section.
That's very much the ground that we are playing in, and maybe when we get to the top, that changes a little bit, but that's where we're going to be at for probably 15 or 16 of these movies. So Ben, you created the list. You always get to do the big reveals. So we left off last time with Fantasia 2000, which was a big disagreement in its own right, sort of a preview for this episode. Let us start with number 41.
Yes, number 41 is the original Disney sequel. They hadn't done a sequel up to this point, unless you count kind of what like some of the war classics as kind of like having sequels within them. But this is, of course, The Rescuers Down Under, the sequel to The Rescuers, in which, believe it or not, they go down to Australia. And I'm just I don't vibe with the Rescuers in general, and I'm going to say it now. Number 40 is also the Rescuers. So like back to back, we've got these two movies. We've both kind of combined into saying that like Rescuers Down Under is slightly worse than the Rescuers, but not like appreciably so. I think I gave them both the exact same score on Letterboxd. However, like my partner loves these movies, and I do feel like this is the start of the era in terms of like these are they feel weirdly placeholdery in terms of the Rescuers Down Under is the Disney movie that comes out after Little Mermaid and before Beauty and the Beast, and it's like the great forgotten movie that like if you do a Renaissance run of Disney movies, you kind of people will go, oh, you need to remember to include Rescuers Down Under in that list, and other people go like, no, skip it, because it really doesn't feel like it's part of the Renaissance. It feels like it's the Disney of the kind of the late 70s and the 80s, kind of like a little bit cheaper, trying to like come up with something that's just going to tie them across. But the reason my partner absolutely adores this movie is there is a lizard called Joanna who likes eating eggs, and she absolutely adores Joanna. And I feel like we're now running into that stage of like there are going to be characters and moments in all of these movies where like you can latch onto and have like a great deal of nostalgia for them, and that might kind of sway you into this is a great movie because I've got so much nostalgia related to like one very iconic thing that the movie does really really well. But yeah, Jerome, what's your opinion on Rescuers Down Under and broadly the Rescuers in general?
So I feel like I'm somewhere in between your partner and you because for me, Rescuers Down Under was 28, Rescuers was 29. So I guess that would place me in between you two. And for me, I think these movies, again, I would say that I think there's a Bob Newhart factor. I think he is a very culturally significant figure for a number of people, and I think I really dig his performance. The reason that I like Rescuers Down Under specifically is I think George C. Scott gives a fantastic voiceover as the villain, and this is at a stage when studios pretended to care about the environment, so every movie seemingly had some sort of a message about the environment. I'm thinking about Fern Gully, but specifically the Rescuers Down Under has a very firm environmental message, which is very much placing this where we had a movie, Oliver and Company, that very much felt like the 80s. But the fact that it does have that environmental message, I think, firmly implants it around this time. And I would agree with you that the Rescuers Down Under does not feel like it belongs in the Disney Renaissance. I would not put it in that same category. But I think these movies are very fun. I think they're very light for the most part. And again, I think the voiceovers in both movies are very good, above average for me, especially in the Rescuers Down Under. I do think you get some of the animation, especially in Down Under, that I think you could see it. You could see like a lot of ideas and a lot of things kind of gestating, and you would see them kind of mature as the Renaissance would go on. So for me, I just think these are two very fun movies. Again, I would not put them in the top tier. Conceptually, I do like I like the idea of the Rescuers, and it is disappointing to me that this never became a TV series because this, to me, above any other Disney movie, could easily have transferred into becoming a TV show because you could just do Rescuers everywhere, and it would really work. So I'm kind of surprised that this never became one. But yes, I very much enjoy both of these movies.
I mean, it kind of feels like Rescuers Down Under is the starting point for what would become the directed like VHS movies that they're going to start making kind of in the wake of Aladdin and whatnot. And like they're also starting to Aladdin is when they start doing like let's turn this into a Saturday morning cartoon show. They've done it already with like Little Mermaid a little bit later that they actually like start adapting that into.
Yeah, they did. I mean, around this time it was basically the in 1990 at this point it was DuckTales, Gummy Bears. I feel like there was one more before the Gummy Bears, but those are the big ones. Tailspin and Rescue Rangers were also very, very soon to follow. So they were kind of going in the direction of using some of their characters. But
it feels like they're like they needed content for like Saturday morning cartoon slots and for the Disney Channel that's going to start a couple of years after this, I believe, and they haven't yet. They're using the classic characters, like they're using the ducks, they're using the chipmunks, they're using like those ones who don't get movies made of them to kind of like support this effort. And then over the course of the 90s, they'll go like, no, we can do a 65 episode TV show based on whatever the hot movie is. And yeah, like it does make it feel weird that Rescuers is like, it's of a different era. Like the Rescuers, which we'll just go on to discussing now, comes out in 1977. And then it takes them 13 years to make a sequel. And if it had come out kind of like maybe 5-6 years later, it would be in that wave of like, oh, let's adapt this into a TV show, because yeah, it's perfect for a episode of the week. Like, let's go to a new country, kids. Let's learn about kind of like what's going on in.
Oh man, the Carmen Sandiego thing.
Yeah. No, Jerome, what do you think about the Rescuers? Since these movies are like they're right next to each other, so go for like what your opinion on the Rescuers is as well.
I do think that one of the underrated aspects of these movies, because again, they feel forgotten because the Rescuers came out at a time when Disney was not exactly at its peak, and then the Rescuers Down Under, yes, it comes after, the Little Mermaid, but this movie really comes out in kind of a dead zone. But I love the chemistry that Eva Gabor and Bob Newhart have. I mean, I think it really comes across well, even though it is animation. I don't know if they were necessarily like recording across from each other, but I think it just works out really well. I think that's part of what carries these movies is their chemistry. So to me, I think that's what makes the first one work so well. And like the second one is at least trying to go for this environmental message. The first one is just a straight up kidnapping story, and I could see it being a little traumatic for kids.
Oh yeah, this first movie is actually really quite dark, and it does feel like a kind of transitional point, because obviously Walt Disney has died during the making of The Jungle Book. The Aristocats and Robin Hood are kind of, they feel like the end of a particular era for Disney, and then there's 4 years of no Disney movie, and then 1977 has got 2 with Winnie the Pooh, which is just 3 shorts being stapled together, and this one, and it does feel like that bridge point between the classic kind of like, let's adapt legends and books and like stuff that's classic with children and whatnot, and obviously The Rescuers is a adaptation of a book series, but moving into the 80s where like there's that little bit more edge, where Rescuers, Fox and the Hound, Black Cauldron, even Great Mouse Detective, all just a little bit darker than they had been making movies like before that point.
Yeah, and I'm curious if we will ever get back to that point, because it seems like Disney is very much stuck in doing anything but those kinds of things in their animated movies. So yeah, I think the late 70s and the early 80s, I mean, you get a lot of experimenting, and even the Rescuers Down Under, I think, are some of the vestiges of that with George C. Scott's performance. But the Rescuers especially is a little bit more on the darker side. But I think we've spent enough time talking about the Rescuers, even though I find them to be entertaining. Still got a lot to go, and this next one is very interesting.
Yes, the next movie that we'll be discussing in at number 39 is Bolt, which I think is probably obviously there is some debate. We discussed Meet the Robinsons near the bottom of our list on the last episode, but Bolt to me feels like the moment where it isn't the kind of like full-throated Disney are kind of back after how awful the 2000s are, but it's the first time that there's like, it feels like there's a little bit of life in these movies. Like, I don't think Bolt is like great. I don't think it's a masterpiece. It's still very much playing in kind of like catch up world to what DreamWorks is doing in the 2000s, but like it feels like they figured out that don't do humans for 3D animation, like to kind of have it be like cute characters and landscapes and whatnot, and they've made it feel like a Saturday morning cartoon, which feels so much more in the wheelhouse of what Disney's actually doing well in the kind of the mid 2000s. And obviously from Bolt onwards is when you start getting the kind of the second boom of kind of Disney. But Bolt is the transitional point, I'd say, and it's solid, if not great, and kind of a hint at better things to come for the company.
I agree with you. Bolt is also What If Buzz Lightyear but a dog. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it's riffing on very similar things of it's basically those classic TV shows of kind of the 80s, like or 70s and 80s of like Million Dollar Man and
Mm.
Bionic Woman and all those kind of things. But like, what if it's a dog and you didn't have to deal with how unruly animals can be on a set and whatnot? Like, it's Lassie if it was Bionic Woman, isn't it? Is kind of the vibe of what.
Yeah, I mean, you would never do an action TV show with an animal because it would just be such a pain in the butt to do. So I think that I think it is very much kind of riffing on those things, but it kind of puts a spin on it because there is a dog that is so heavily involved, and because it's animation, you don't have to worry about controlling an actual dog. Yeah, I think this movie is a lot of fun. A very good voiceover. I mean, I think John Travolta is the perfect person for this role for so many reasons. You also get a young Miley Cyrus as Penny in this movie, and their relationship, I think, kind of carries things. And I just think it's a fun movie. I remember seeing this with a bunch of animation students, so they were very much picking it apart at that time in 2008. And I think the other thing that I really like is the fact that it's 96 minutes. It feels like it gets in, it gets out. It is good. It is not great, but I think it works for what it is trying to do. And it definitely feels like, okay, this is a point when Disney is going to actually get good again, and then you're going to get another movie that's on our list that comes out a couple of years later, and that's when it feels like, okay, this has the potential to, if not hit the peak of Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Lion King, at least get us somewhere closer to that.
Yes, absolutely. And then in at number 38 is kind of almost the inverse of Bolt in terms of like it feels like a transitional point into whatever this new era of Disney is going to be, where 38 is Strange World. It is an original idea. It is the first time that Disney feel like they're making explicit on things that people have been asking them for years in terms of having queer representation in the movie. It is a huge sci-fi kind of original movie in the way that Atlantis uh, and Treasure Planet were kind of like 20 years beforehand. And I don't think it's like the most successful movie in that realm, but for like Disney have kind of ended up in this weird situation where they basically do like 1 year they do a musical, 1 year they do kind of an original action epic um kind of vibe, and Strange World is like you fine tune it kind of that 5-10% and you maybe have kind of like something that's going to be really great. And I can almost imagine kind of 10, 15, 20 years from now there's going to be an entire generation of kids who are like, no, Strange World is like my Disney movie, that one's really underrated and we need to be taking Strange World like a lot more seriously
I could see that.
than we do.
Part of the problem with this movie, I think the marketing was really bad. I remember the trailers just not representing this movie well at all in terms of the content and some of the themes. I just think this is a very kind of boisterous, colorful movie that, yes, does have those original sci-fi concepts, but I don't think you necessarily got that with the marketing, and I think that is one of the biggest fatal flaws, and I think that's why this movie didn't do nearly as well as it should have.
No, like that's the thing. It's like this one shouldn't have been the box office flop that it was, especially when I think I remember when this movie was coming out, it was like in the wake of Encanto, and you're like, oh, Disney have finally figured it out, and everyone like this movie will explode when it hits Disney Plus. And sadly, this movie doesn't have the songs that made Encanto into the kind of mimetic thing. It isn't as good a movie as Encanto either.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, is that when you're in a situation where I think people just in our review culture expect the greatest thing ever or the worst thing ever, you get this movie that's kind of maybe like 3 to 3.5 stars, and people just aren't into that as much. I mean, I still enjoy Strange World for what it is. Like, I could rewatch this a million times and not get tired of it. I remember seeing it in theaters and really enjoying it. I do have it slightly higher on my list than you do, but I think it's a perfectly good Disney movie. I don't think it's in that middle tier for me, but for me, I think this movie deserved a little bit better.
Yeah, I think it suffers from the trend of the modern Disney movies in terms of the hesitance to have a actual villain in the movie. Like instead, the villains are familial trauma, they are general concepts, they are the environment, they are all these like different things that are kind of like fighting against it, and you lack a kind of and I don't want to say like minimize it to a black and white kind of view of like what is good and what is bad, but like they don't have that strong other to hang their hat on in movies nowadays, and they always have to soften it, or there always has to be some reason for the villainous turn. And Strange World is no different to that, where like the main conflict driving the movie is the relationship between the three family leads, and it kind of leaves you at this thing where like, well, actually there's no, the stakes of the world are separate to the actual like familial story engine, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think if you don't have a musical, I think you almost have to have a villain,
Mm,
because I think with a movie that's higher on our list, I think part of what makes that movie work is you do have the songs. With this movie, you don't even have that. So I think that you're kind of missing two elements that I think are crucial for what makes a successful Disney movie. And I don't know that we're ever going to get back to that. I don't know that Mulan 2 is even going to have a villain. And it feels like this is a real problem that Disney's having, is just the lack of willingness to have actual villains.
mm. And like we will get into better movies that do this later on the list, because obviously this is a thing that goes on throughout all the 2010s. But the fact that it has been since
Yes.
15 years since we've had like a proper like full-throated villain song in any one of these movies is kind of wild, considering how much the 90s are based around these things. And you would think that Disney would be going, no, we need to be building a repertoire of these guys to walk around the Disney parks. Like you want to be seeing a new Maleficent, a new Gaston, a new like all of these guys like wandering the Disney parks and like being a little bit scary and intimidating. And instead, it's not. They are dweeby or misunderstood, or there's just something about them that doesn't make them an actual villain. But yeah, we'll discuss that later on.
So
But you,
here's a question. So you mentioned that the issue of there being no villains, Strange World is very sci-fi based. Do you think that part of the problem may inadvertently be, okay, Disney has Star Wars, so they're going to create the sci-fi movie and they don't want it to seem like Star Wars, so no villain. Do you think that plays any role whatsoever, or is that just a
I
coincidence?
think it's just a coincidence, because you look at it like Raya and the Last Dragon's got this issue, Encanto's got this issue,
Fair
Moana's
enough.
got this issue. Like it doesn't matter what genre they're playing in. All of these things have, there is something about them where you think there is going to be a villain or a villainous moment, and then they will subvert it into being, actually this is about something else. And it's not bad, it's just it's it makes them feel like there's a lot more of a formula to these movies,
So
even
let
when
me broaden the question then. Do you think the fact that Disney has Marvel and Star Wars, they do have explicit villains, there is the idea of good versus evil? Do you think that might be the problem?
I definitely think they're trying to differentiate the brands, and they're definitely trying to do like, oh, we need to, maybe it is a level of like we need to level up kids into like wanting good versus evil, and it's more of a teenage thing that we've got Marvel and Star Wars that kind of appeal more to that demographic and whatnot. um but the thing is, like, if that is the case, I think it's very wrong-headed for Disney to be acting in that way, because it's like, no, like you don't like, you look at these things, and Scar can exist in the same world as Darth Vader can exist in the same world as the Green Goblin and stuff like that. Like, if that is what's motivating them, I think they need to stop. And because of that, it feels like it's brand synergy and corporate bullshit that's kind of impacting the actual creative storytelling side of it. And yeah, I hope that isn't it. And it probably, to me, it feels more like the current story team they've got are trying to do more thematically resonant things, and by doing more thematically resonant things, they're minimizing their ability to do just meat and potatoes, kind of like black white good evil storytelling.
Yeah, I think their focus is on ideas more so than plot. And I think that gets represented even when we were talking about Wish. That is a movie that feels very much, it feels like they spent a lot of time conceptualizing the different aspects instead of focusing on character and plot. And I think that is something that is probably going to come up again with Mulan 2. in any other movie that Disney releases. But up next, I could see a certain generation of adults perhaps getting offended at the placement of our next movie.
I'm offended by the placement of this next movie. Jerome has got his wish. By ranking Hercules at 38, he's put it at number 37 on our list. I had this in the top 30, and I don't think that Hercules is incredible, but I do, and it is this kind of the start of the downswing of the Renaissance. But it's still probably the two best directors that Disney have ever had in their stable making this movie, and the issues with it feel more like there was a push to include real world like referential humor. Like the whole Hercules is treated much like Michael Jordan, feels weird to do in this movie, and doesn't, it particularly dates the movie. But I think you have an A+ villain with Hades. We'll ignore whoever voiced that character. I don't think I think
unfortunately nobody voiced him. It's really sad.
I think Meg is fantastic as the love interest, and is obviously kind of like a big signal for queer women in kind of like Disney fandoms. I feel absolutely love Meg. It's a fantastic supporting performance by Danny DeVito. Like the actual structure of Hercules is really good, and I think the only thing that drags it down is the urge to include the referential humor to 90s pop culture that kind of like distract from
and it would get better. It would not get better.
It does not get better, not at all. But why do you think Hercules is? Obviously, you've got it 38. It's not. It's lower than everything we've had so far, but still, obviously, not in that bottom tier of anything we've done.
I think that this definitely felt like, I remember seeing this in theaters when it came out, and I remember definitely feeling like, okay, this is a bit of a downswing. This is not at the level of a Lion King. This is not at the level of a Little Mermaid. And maybe that's completely unfair. You have to judge a movie on its own merits. And in looking at this movie kind of separated away from that era, I do think that it has its moments. I do think it is funny. I think the referential humor really hurts it a lot. And I think that in some ways, I feel like other movies have done this very similar plot line, if not better, than with more nuance. I mean, this is the kind of plot that you see all the time, where a god gets punished by becoming human, or something to that effect, or gets banished to Earth. I think this is something that, I mean, even Marvel has done this with Thor. And I don't know if that was necessarily better, but again, it's something that feels very familiar. It feels like at this point, Danny DeVito is kind of playing the same role as Robin Williams did in Aladdin. So that just feels like kind of a knockoff, even though I do think Danny DeVito is funny, and I think he's the perfect person for that voice. I think Tate Donovan is kind of underrated as Hercules as well. And I think there is just a better movie I think that they were capable of. I think if they had focused on kind of classical Disney storytelling and stayed away from the referential humor, I think this movie would be so much better. And I think this could easily have been in the top 30. I think there's a real interesting story to be told about gods and how gods behave and what obligations they have. So yeah, I think that this is a movie that is good, but I don't think that it is as good as it could have been.
No, and I think part of that is the compromise on, this is not the movie that Musker and Clements wanted to make. They were still desperate to be making Treasure Planet at this point. And this was the compromise movie. This was, you guys have made some of our most successful movies at this point. Do one more for the company and we'll let you go do your big wild swing. And you can feel the, not lack of investment, because I think they're professionals who know exactly what they're doing, but this isn't a personal movie for them, and I think it does hurt this one. And again, it's also the Disney machinery has gotten so big, and all of these movies are expected to be huge hits, and so therefore the structure of the Renaissance is kind of crumbling around this one, and we're only kind of 2-3 years away from kind of like the definitive endpoint of this era of Disney, where they were the kings of animation, and DreamWorks are coming to steal an awful lot of their thunder. But any more to say on Hercules?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so at number 36, we're going back a few decades at this point to The Sword and the Stone, which is a movie that you really, really like. Like, this is one of our biggest disagreements on this list. You've got Sword and the Stone in at 24, Jerome. I have it at number 43. So I'll let you go with the gush first before I come in with the more level-headed critique of the film.
I mean, I think I have a soft spot for both this style, this director, and kind of the more classical. Like, this is still a lot of the vestiges of the classic Disney as opposed to what it would become in the 70s and the 80s. And I think that's part of why I enjoy this movie so much. I think the Merlin character, I think it's done really well. I think there's both humor and there's some pretty good side gags with him. And I don't know. I just think that this is a fun kind of classic Disney movie. I don't think it's necessarily in that top tier, but what I think when it does work, I think it works really well. And I think again, you're getting back to this idea of this classic story of the boy of trying to get the sword out of the stone. And I just think that part of why this works out so well is sort of the energy being put into it. And I think this is the Disney touch was perfect for this story and making it a young boy. Yeah, I really enjoyed a lot of the elements and a lot of the voiceovers and things of that nature. So yeah, that's why I really enjoyed this. So tear my dreams apart, Ben. Go for it.
I mean, I think that this is a movie that I remember having on VHS, and definitely one that I would like wear out in terms of like watching it, because I mean, it's a Disney movie that's set in England. There's this kind of like the run of movies that are in that era where they're very much based on British books and British legends and whatnot. Like either side of this is 101 Dalmatians and The Jungle Book, and obviously Jungle Book is definitely not set in England, but it is very much a British colonizers view of that part of the world.
Boy, howdy is it.
But Sword in the Stone, it almost feels like this is the era where the Disney movies are getting an awful lot cheaper, but they are also rallying around singular directions, like you've mentioned, Wolfgang Reitherman for like directing basically every movie for like 20 years in the Disney repertoire. And this is his first solo director credit, but obviously that's more because animation is weird and you would have different people kind of like dealing with different things. But in comparison to 101 Dalmatians, which is a couple years beforehand, this movie is very, very episodic, and I think it is very much different episodes are stronger than other ones. Like I think Madam Mim is incredible and kind of the high point of this movie, but then there are other ones where it feels like there's not enough story content to fill out like a short. It feels like they've gone like, right, every single one of these needs to be kind of like 15 20 minutes or whatever, and sometimes it's like you could have done this one in kind of like 10
leave
15.
The squirrel part alone. Leave the squirrel scene alone, Ben.
The squirrel scene is not as good as Madam Mim.
It's not. I would agree with you on that.
And then it's also very funny for this movie to basically, like, obviously it's all about Merlin teaching, and Merlin is obviously a proto genie that they'll like come back to 30 years later and do better with genie, I think, kind of undeniably.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I would say so.
But yeah, it's more this level of like, you've got this thing where it's all about the training of young Arthur before he becomes the King of England by pulling the sword from the stone, and the movie kind of like gets to the end and it's like, oh, we'll do 5 minutes of the Sword and the Stone, and you don't actually get into any of the history of that. And obviously it's because the book it's based on is the story of young King Arthur as opposed to like actual King Arthur. But yeah, it's fine. It's solid for what it is, but I kind of wish that like all of the individual components of it added up into a more satisfying whole, and it was definitely one that I felt didn't stand up to the nostalgia of my childhood viewings of it.
See, you usually, because with the package ones, you tended to enjoy those. So it's surprising to me that you didn't embrace the episodic style, as I've kind of been the one that's been poo-pooing it, and this one I liked a lot more.
I think it's more to do with the I can kind of like delineate between individual chapters in the other ones, where Sword and Stone is nominally trying to build up to a cohesive whole, if that makes sense. And also it is longer than the other package movies.
It is. I mean, it's not offensively long, but it is definitely hitting that 90-minute mark for sure. Yeah, I think this is just a matter of your mileage may vary, and in terms of style, I think I just appreciated this more than you did. The next movie, we're right about the same, at least for the next one.
Yeah, the next one is, I mean, if we're talking about like package movies and long movies or short movies, in this case, Winnie the Pooh at number 35, the 2011 new Winnie the Pooh movie, which I think is like a breezy 66 minutes. Like it's not very long at all. It's it's not original Winnie the Pooh content. I think it is very loosely adapted from a couple of the A.A. Milne stories, but definitely not as explicitly as the 77 movie is. But this one I think is solid. I don't love it as much as the 77 Winnie the Pooh movie, but it's so obvious that Disney have got like a really firm hold of these characters. Like I don't think they very rarely taken a step wrong with their handling of this brand in a very interesting way where
Ben, do I need to mention the live action Christopher Robin movie?
I like the live action Christopher Robin movie.
I mean, I like it, but it just feels it's very depressing, and
it is very depressing, and maybe that's why I liked it. Is it feels like I don't know, like, and I also I like the Winnie the Pooh like TV show from the 80s. I think is like remarkably
just
like
my
solid.
main reference is the show from the 80s more so than the movies, oddly enough.
Yeah. And this one, like again, I think it's like solid, kind of like 3 stars. It's obviously tragically it's the final 2D animated movie from Disney Animation Studios, and it has one sequence which I think is like maybe the funniest thing that has ever been put in a Disney movie, which is the characters are trapped inside a hole and they're trying to tell Piglet how to let them out, and it is just a 5-minute sequence in this movie which is absolutely incredible. And like if nothing else, go away and watch that like bit on YouTube or load up Disney Plus and watch it on there, because it is more than worth it just for that. But otherwise it's it feels like there's some level of like modernism that's in fact, like obviously you got a Zooey Deschanel song in this one, which feels weirdly again like pop culture referencey for a franchise which is so inherently timeless in everything else that it does.
Except when it goes to the Christopher Robin movie, and it's taking place during like World War II or something, or just after World War II.
Yeah, because obviously, what like it's A.A. Milne was writing that for Christopher Robin in the 1920s or whatever. Because that's why we've now had 2 Blood and Honey horror movies.
Thank goodness we've had 2, and more to come, I'm sure. I mean, I think I would echo a lot of the sentiments that you're saying. I think that this is a movie that, I mean, it's clearly the most, I would say, kiddie of any of the movies on this list, just about. But I still think it works, man. Like 60 minutes, you're in, you're out, and I think it's a very pleasant watch. It's very, I guess the word I would use to describe it is very lo-fi. Like this, we talk about our criticisms of not having villains. Winnie the Pooh should never ever have a villain, except unless like Winnie the Pooh struggling to get out of a cave because he's festively plump. Like that's the villain. We don't need villains in the Winnie the Pooh universe. It would almost be offensive to do so. I just think it's a very fun watch. And in my friend group, it's basically agreed that I'm the rabbit of the group. Ben, are you like Piglet or Winnie, or like what? Who are you?
I don't know who I've been described. I mean, I need to check in with my friend group of like where I stand on that. I think I've been called an owl. I've been called a Tigger. I've been called like many, so I'm not sure where the ultimate end. I'll ask a friend group tonight, and I will send you across their findings.
I also think it's funny that Tom Kenny does the voice of Rabbit, because my God, Tom Kenny has just, if you are looking for a voiceover performer, he has literally been in every famous and infamous animated show that there's been in the last 30 years.
Really has. And because what he's Rabbit, or is he?
He's Rabbit. Yes.
He's Rabbit, and then he loses out on Rabbit to Peter Capaldi for the Christopher Robin movie, isn't it?
As you do.
I think that's a level up, in all honesty.
I mean, maybe in terms of famous, yes. I'm not a big Doctor Who person, so that that's part of the problem.
But have you seen The Thick of It?
I have not.
Oh, you need to go see The Thick of It. If you want a crash course in our fucked up political situation, go watch The Thick of It, which is obviously the precursor to Veep for American viewers, but obviously is dealing with a different set of political structures.
Fair enough. So this next movie then is really interesting. It is in the exact same spot on both of our lists.
It is a perfect tie, and even though we both had it at number 32, it comes in at number 34.
Because math.
Because math. The movie is Raya and the Last Dragon, which is was it the second or the first movie they released in the pandemic? I guess it is, because it was supposed to be the 2020 Disney movie, and instead it kind of comes out spring of 2021, just in that kind of like, after Tenet failed to reopen cinemas, this is Disney kind of like getting in at the same time as In the Heights and whatnot, wasn't it?
Yeah, this is one of those movies that was released on Disney Plus where they added the surcharge of $30. It was this and then Black Widow that came out a couple months after. So this is kind of their game plan for navigating 2021. It is a movie that feels very representative of Disney in that the movie just feels very unsure of itself at times. I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of good elements. And this is also the movie that got Lindsay Ellis canceled.
it is the movie that got Lindsay Ellis cancelled, and she has dropped her first video on YouTube since that event. But this is it's a really interesting movie in terms of it's so obviously indebted to the things that it's riffing on. It very much is in conversation with anime, and obviously the thing that got Lindsay Ellis cancelled was the comparing it to Avatar: The Last Airbender. It is obviously very much a attempt at kind of an action epic. Again, we said like Strange World is that, Big Hero 6 is that, trying to be this kind of like bigger, maybe appealing to kind of teenage boys. There's accusations of kind of queer baiting in this movie, where like, again, this movie is probably like a half star to a star better if they can just acknowledge that the two lead human characters are probably a little bit in love with each other. But because it's playing in all of these different wheelhouses, where it's obviously it's indebted to not only a Asian mythology that is kind of inspiring it, but also the ways in which that Asian mythology has kind of filtered through manga and comics and movies and anime and cartoons and whatnot, is you end up feeling like you've seen a lot of the things that it's talking about before, and you kind of waiting for that moment where they're going to level up and kind of like show like, this is the reason why Disney had to make this. This is where the budget is going. This is like, we can condense this into 90 minutes. We don't need 4 seasons. We don't need 300 episodes of an anime to kind of like get to this point. And it never quite gets to that point of convincing you why this movie necessarily needed to exist, or it could, like, why it couldn't differentiate itself from these other things that exist. Obviously, love that Disney are trying to do more inclusive things, adapt stories from different cultures, like actually putting people from various ethnic backgrounds into the creative process of this. Like, yes, Don Hall is the director on this one, but they also get Blind Spotting's Carlos Lopez Estrada to kind of like be the co-director on this, and Keen Yuen and Eda Lim are kind of like doing the script for it, rather than the kind of the normal Disney like brain trust of these things. And again, is it just there's a level of fear or a level of kind of safety, like smoothing off rounded edges or whatnot, that Disney is doing, that kind of like don't let it be as prickly or as nuanced as maybe it can be for this kind of movie. But what are your feelings kind of like 3 years
I
on
think
from?
I think the problem is that whenever I think a lot of movies are guilty of this, they go for this vaguely Southeastern Asian feel to it, and they never get specific. I think what they underestimate is just how different a Korea is from a Japan or a China, and I think that's a huge issue. Is that these movies, I would say, are not specific enough in terms of, okay, we're going to be Asian, but what does that actually mean? And I think that is actually the problem. And the difference with something like this and Encanto feels a little bit more specific in terms of cultural references, whereas this, it's again Asian, but what does that actually mean? Are we going for something more Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean? I think is where the movie falters, is that it doesn't have that willingness to go all the way. And I think you said, made that clear in your comments as well. I still think the movie is very good at times, and I think there is the potential. Like, this to me felt like it could have been great if there were just a couple of additional choices. I don't know if they needed to go harder with the villain. I don't know if this was a musical. Like, if they do this as a musical, that differentiates it from being Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I almost wonder if that was the secret sauce. But I think their thinking is Asian audiences don't like musicals, which is why Mulan, the live action, was not a musical. So was that their logic? But again, for me, I think this being a musical might have actually elevated it to being something different, and you're definitely taking more of a chance as well.
Yeah, it's an odd movie, and again, we're going to pivot into something very, very different. In with number 34,
Yeah,
obviously
we're very much going all over the place on this list. There's like no thematic consistency. We're just kind of bouncing back and forth.
I have a link. So obviously 34, like in 2 movies time, we're going to get back to very much the very similar conversation that we had with Raya the Last Dragon. But number 33, in the 2010s, Disney's obviously trying to be inclusive and broaden and kind of appeal to a global market. And number 33 features one of the most racist caricatures of all time in any Disney movie. We are, of course, talking about Lady and the Tramp, which is not only racist, but also anti-cat.
And given what a year for cats it's been, Ben. I don't know if I don't think you've seen A Quiet Place Day One, but
I'm seeing it tomorrow.
Cats are being redeemed in a big way this year. I know there's been a lot of other cats in media, and yeah, the anti-catness of this movie certainly doesn't help it. I mean, I think The Lady and the Tramp is very cute, and that's really all I can say. I mean, I just think that that's kind of where it falls down for me, is that I like it. I never fully embraced it. And I think you like this a little bit more than I did, but it's not too much of a difference. And I don't know, man, like for me, I kind of struggled with this one in terms of its ranking and how I felt about it, because there are definitely parts of it that I think are really good, and then there are parts of it that are just kind of eh.
It's kind of a classic problem with a lot of Disney movies of this era, where there's a lot of almost like filler content in it, and then around it are some of the most iconic sequences in all of animation that have kind of like really, really strongly held the test of time. Obviously, Lady and the Tramp is the spaghetti scene, which is like still parodied to this day. Like, if you ever have animals eating like in Italian food in an alleyway, like, you are doing a riff on this movie. And I can't remember the last time I saw it, but it's definitely one of those things where like everyone will have their attempt at like subverting the scene, doing something different with this scene. Like, ooh, wouldn't it be funny if they actually ate like animals in this scene? Ooh, wouldn't it be funny if like they actually acted kind of like stray dogs and stuff like that? And I don't know, it's iconic, but I wouldn't say it's like 100% of everything in it has like aged incredibly well, but enough of it has aged to that, like in that kind of like way that you want it to, that I'm willing to give it for the past that things that don't. But obviously, like, the racism is like completely unforgivable in terms of the depiction of kind of like Asian cultures in this movie through anthropomorphization.
I will say, in terms of the Asian racism, and look, I'm not going to sit here and defend it, but it feels like that form of racism is definitely something that has been acceptable for even longer than a lot of other forms. I mean, to the point where even a show as recent as How I Met Your Mother had yellowface in it. So it's definitely something that has taken a long time to get over, and that does not make it okay. But I think when you put that in context, I think it's important to just know just some of the issues, especially with forms of Asian racism that have come about. Yeah, The Lady and the Tramp is a movie that I don't really have a lot to say about, just because I mean, it is literally 36. It comes at that point where I think the movies are good, but they're not like great. They're not, especially with this being kind of in the classical Disney mold. It just feels like they did a better, I would say, version of this earlier than this movie, and then they did a much better version later on, which we'll talk about later in this episode.
Yes, we will. But the next two are probably the two where we're most going to be putting on the boxing gloves and actually like having words with each other, because
Here we
both
go.
of, both of these movies that we're about to discuss now are in our top 20. In fact, the next three will be in one of our top 20s. And it's literally just a matter of the other one of us having it in kind of the 40s that has dragged it down to this point. But we're going to start
Okay.
with Jerome's number 15, my number 47. It is, of course, one of the movies that made Disney $1 billion in 2019. We are talking about Frozen 2.
Wow, it is wild to me how different our viewpoints on Frozen are, because there's also, it's not as big of a gulf, but there is a gulf that we will talk about later on among the Frozens. And I mean, look, I, for me to come out and actually defend a movie that made $1 billion is almost kind of absurd, because it's made all that money. But I do have some hot takes about this movie. I think Into the Unknown is a better song than Let It Go. That's my first hot take.
Okay.
Any feelings on that?
Into the Unknown's kind of been ruined for me by the fact that I just hear the Panic at the Disco version more than I hear the actual version from the movie.
Well,
So
that
whilst
sounds like a you problem.
it's very much a me problem, but it does mean that when I hear that, I'm like, interesting. I can't actually like form a concrete opinion about the actual Into the Unknown. I will say I do quite frequently get the little kind of like vocal riff from this movie stuck in my head. Like, it is a very kind of like earwormy, like that, like
It is
like.
very, yeah. It's honestly probably the last earworm thing that we've gotten from Disney. I mean, as good as Encanto can be, I just don't think that that has as much of a rift. And look, I think part of the problem with this movie is that Frozen was so popular and had so many different ideas, that to come back with Frozen 2, I mean, the docu series that they did is actually really interesting, and I would strongly recommend people find it on Disney Plus, because I think this movie was kind of a mess to put together, and I think that that does get represented, but I don't think it hurts the quality of the movie. I kind of, again, we've talked about the lack of villain. I kind of wish there was one in this movie. I wish they had found a way to kind of put one in there, just because I think it would have elevated it that much more. But I do think that a lot of the themes that they took from the first one, keeping it focused on the sister relationship, I think that's really kind of it's really impressive to me that they were able to expand on that. The Olaf stuff, I think it works. I mean, I think that there was a lot of criticism of it at the time. I mean, the Olaf 20-minute special they put before. What am I thinking of?
Is it Incredibles 2?
No, it's the Pixar movie that I'm blanking on. Yes, like that's an abomination, and I feel like people carried that into this movie and continued their hate of Olaf, which I can kind of justify at times, but I think it was at least interesting, and it was at least trying to kind of up the maturity level. So Ben, tell me why I'm wrong.
You say that you don't feel like this movie being a mess behind the scenes hurts it, and I can only see kind of like the fact that they didn't have a movie like 5 months from the release and stuff like that, and they had no idea how they were going to end it. And there's like stuff in this where it just feels very obviously like they were rewriting it, and the only reason they made it is because they needed to make a sequel to Frozen, and they didn't know how they were going to like thematically tie it all off. To me, it's just very emblematic of kind of the inherent problems with the way that Disney is making their movies in the 2010s, like the lack of the villain, I mean, potentially inadvertent ways, but it feels like there probably are a lot of people who are queer or marginalized who are behind the scenes on these movies, and like Elsa's story becomes so much more rich if she is queer or trans or all of these different things. And there's all these different readings that you can make on these movies and make them that make them say that there's subtext there for it. But like the fact that Disney would never ever 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 make them text feels depressing. Like when you have the songs that are in this movie, obviously there's Into the Unknown, but there's what's the one from is it all is found, or like the other? No, it is in. No, it's Show Yourself. Show Yourself is the song in this movie, which feels like a coming out song. It feels like Elsa is realizing something about themselves, and then the movie kind of like can't properly kind of like thread the needle on that. And I mean, ultimately, like I don't think this is an awful movie. I just think it's a huge step down from the first Frozen. I do think the Olaf stuff is overplayed, and the even like threatening Olaf with like what his plot line at the end of this movie is feels kind of disingenuous to the audience in a lot of ways. And then on top, but then ultimately, like it's also a movie with a cute magical salamander, and Disney do those cute little animals really really well, and I can't deny that.
I mean, think about the porgs even in Star Wars. Think about how cute the porgs were.
Oh, miss the porgs.
We need more porgs. We need Mubabu Freck in our lives.
Isn't he showing up in something soon?
I don't know, either him or his species. What? All the shows. Just give me a Babu Frick show, and I think everything will be better. That's my opinion.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, Frozen 2. I think it's just there's something about it that just kind of felt like it felt cash grabby in a way that I feel like a lot of the Disney sequels that they're making at this point in time feel like, and it's why I'm like,
yeah, I can certainly see it.
Struggling to get excitement for Moana 2, which feels like a cash grab kind of thing.
Mulan 2 was originally supposed to be a TV show, so this is going to be even more. I think this. I would say it's going to be bottom tier. That's how I'm feeling about it right
now. But yeah, I mean that's Frozen 2. But now we need to talk about one of my favorite movies on this list that Jerome dislikes. Which
not only do I dislike this movie, but I dislike the director. Oh boy, it's coming. It's coming.
We will. Here we go. The director is coming, and I will agree. The director is god awful. However, this is, I mean, much like Frozen 2, this is a movie with a famously discordant kind of behind the scenes making of this movie. At number 31, it is The Emperor's New Groove, which maybe is me showing my age with this being one of the ones that I would have seen in cinema at like the exact right age. Like I'm 8 years old when this movie comes out. But I'm gonna let you go first because like you have a strong dislike for this movie.
So Mark Dindal has committed crimes against animation, and his greatest crime to this day is still Chicken Little. I want to be absolutely clear on that. This is his greatest crime, but he also has recently committed another crime by directing the Garfield movie, which is also an abomination. You know, I would have thought after 20 years in director's jail or whatever jail he was in for making Chicken Little, I would have thought, you know, just don't let him direct animation anymore. And then he does the Garfield movie. I think you see a lot of the seeds of both of those movies in this one with the references, the noise, the loudness, the annoying characters, the daddy issues. It's all there, Ben. It is all there, especially the daddy issues.
I think this movie is really funny. I think it is maybe the most consistently funny Disney movie. Like this is kind of out and out, like almost a sitcom. Like it is The Odd Couple. It is taking those tried and tested kind of like genre trappings to kind of like build this thing up. But then you've got a like legendary performance from Patrick Warburton. Eartha Kitt is incredible. It's John Goodman a year before, obviously, he goes over to Pixar, and I'm not going to say that Patcher in this is better than Sully in Monsters Inc., but I do think it shows like just how much of a professional he is, and I do think when you look at who they have in this movie in terms of the voice actors with David Spade and John Goodman and Patrick Warburton and Wendy Malick, they're going for that kind of sitcom-y vibe. In ways that are like obviously to diminishing returns with Chicken Little, but I think in this movie they do nail the rhythms of something that is supposed to be far more outwardly funny than these movies normally are. And I think that's why it kind of like stands the test of time, is because it's doing far more interesting things with kind of like actual physical animation comedy kind of thing, or like actual character dynamics and whatnot. Like, I don't know, like there's just something about this, and it probably just shows like how really like comedy is the most subjective of kind of like most genre forms, where if you don't find something funny, it can be just annoying and grating, but if you do find it funny, then you're gonna overlook kind of like potentially flaws, or like just not understand people when they say like, oh no, this was grating and loud and obnoxious to me.
I will say, I think John Goodman, Eartha Kitt, Patrick Warburton, they are definitely the highlights of the movie. I do like the animation style for the most part, as you're getting some of the vestiges of the Renaissance. So I think there's still elements of this movie that work. But I mean, look, the big issue for me is that having David Spade as the lead character, I think is probably the biggest sin of this movie, and probably why it is so low, because I just don't buy him as somebody who can go through this kind of emotional arc, because that's not who David Spade is in my mind, and I think that's why this is as low as it is. But I mean, look, if you're going to cast John Goodman in something, it's probably going to be far better than if John Goodman isn't in it, and I would include that for any project he's in. I mean, especially and most notably Roseanne. I mean, John Goodman's really the thread. He's the person that I think really holds that show together in so many ways, even more so than Laurie Metcalf. And I mean, Patrick Warburton is a legendary voiceover performer at this point, too. Here he was just kind of starting out, but I mean, you look at what he's done over the years, especially on Family Guy, which roll your eyes, but I mean, that show's been on the air for a really long time at this point, and Patrick Warburton is a huge part of its success. And yeah, I think that there are elements of this movie that I think work, but overall, kind of a miss for me.
To me, I think the thing that kind of like separates this movie and kind of like elevates it is, obviously, I mean, I would probably say I have less of a knowledge of David Spade in terms of, I think I've only seen one movie in which he is like the lead of, which would be Joe Dirt, and like I think he is one of those guys of that era, especially in the Sandler wheelhouse, where like when you give them control of a project, they kind of bend it towards something that is unappealing. And I feel like he can be a good performer, and removing the ability for him to kind of like shape this to him is a benefit to this movie. If he was a bigger star when this movie came out, or had been leading movies for a few more years, I can imagine him being like a producer and them trying to fit to his like star persona. Whereas I feel like for whatever this movie, there is vestiges of it, but it's definitely not like David Spade is the only person that could do this role, and he's doing like ad libs and improvising in the booth, and I think that's to the movie's benefit.
Have you not seen Tommy Boy?
I've not seen Tommy Boy.
I mean, if you're going to see a David Spade movie, that's the one. I mean, that's the one, especially being with Chris Farley. I mean, that is where I think you see David Spade in his wheelhouse, kind of at his best, really, playing more of a side character, playing the snarky kind of sidekick. I think that's where his strengths lie.
No, that is fair enough and makes sense. But moving on to another like great tragedy that I've inflicted upon you, Jerome. Your number 16 is number 30 on this list, because I had it at number 42. Weirdly, is this an episode of Superhero Pantheon? Because we're talking Big Hero 6, a Marvel adaptation of all things in the Disney wheelhouse. Although not that you would even realize it is an adaptation of a Marvel comic beyond the obligatory Stan Lee appearance, who I don't think has ever written anything. Like, if you asked him in the last year of his life who were the Big Hero 6, he would not be able to tell you, I do not think.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if he would be able to tell you very much, sadly. But this is a movie that I really enjoy. And coming into this, so yes, we did talk about this for Superhero Pantheon. It did not make the Pantheon, we'll say that. But I still really like it. I think that this is a movie that was kind of just short. I remember us like in terms of the numbers, like it was like at a 77 or something like that, and the cutoff is 80. So this came just short. I think it still works out very well. I really like the animation style. I think a lot of my earlier critiques about kind of being vaguely Asian also apply to this movie as well, and that's kind of what holds it back. I do like the superhero elements. Baymax, of course, is an all-time character. I think even if you are not as big of a fan of the movie, you have to agree with that, right? Baymax
Baymax
rules,
rules.
please.
Baymax rules.
Okay.
Baymax innocent. If this movie was entirely Baymax, then it probably would be like a 4-star movie. Sadly, there's um, the human characters who I think are probably, again, it's just that it's the same issue with Raya and with Frozen, and obviously like because even this movie, like it's a superhero movie, and there should be kind of like a very clear villain, and instead this movie is still trying to do that thing of like it's a villain but with a like there's an emotional reason for why they're doing this, and maybe they can be redeemed and whatnot, and it kind of
I think it works out a little bit better here. I think they framed it well. I certainly understand where you're coming from. And I think that's probably why I mean, yes, there was a TV show, but they really never did a sequel. And I'm going to guess why they never did a sequel. I mean, there's probably a couple of reasons because of Marvel just kind of taking things over in terms of the superhero realm. And number two is I don't think they really want to have a villain. And I think that's really, really unfortunate. Yeah, I think in terms of the animation style and the action in this movie is really good. I appreciate that. It's just unfortunate that poor Fred does not have anybody to voice him over either. So really unfortunate.
I know it's weird to just have like when they list his name, there's just a blank space
Yeah,
next to
it's
it.
really really odd.
But yeah, this movie is good. Like, that's the thing is like I think Disney have got a really strong wheelhouse of actual directors, like the kind of the Chris Williams, the Don Halls, like all of those guys that they've got kind of doing the non-musical movies almost, um, are really like strong in a technical sense. But I'm just there's again maybe because you didn't watch these all chronologically, did you? When you went through your ranking of this
I
list,
did not. I did not watch them chronologically. No.
and maybe that is what is kind of like changing our opinions on this is like you're jumping around and seeing them in isolation, whereas for me this was very much like a week before I'd seen another movie that was kind of playing in a very similar wheelhouse, and you see that kind of like superstructure of the Disney movies. And obviously it's great from a contextualizing point of view, but it does sometimes mean that you're comparing it to kind of the two movies previous, or the kind of like you're aware of what the next movie is going to be as well if you've seen them before.
I can see that. I mean, I think there's legitimate reasons for watching it either way. I think that I was trying to for me, I was making a conscious choice to skip around and look. Part of the issue is that, especially when you get into like the 60s and 70s, you know, a lot of those movies, it feels like you can get into kind of a rut, and to just break that up. I mean, that's why I didn't do it in order. But I think Big Hero 6 is so interesting just because, again, they're kind of playing in the Marvel wheelhouse, and it feels like a movie that maybe they wouldn't even do at this point. Maybe this would become like whatever Marvel animation becomes, but I definitely appreciated it at the time, and still do.
No, and it totally. I think again, my point of view is coming from this, and it's like this is the movie that follows up Wreck-It Ralph and Frozen, and I was like, it's a step down to me from both of those movies, and I think that contributes to kind of like where it ultimately ended up on my list at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And the next movie is again another disparity, not quite as large as the kind of the three previous ones we've had. Number 29 is a movie which is among the directors. It is the debut of Musker and Clements as a team, although there are other directors credited on this movie. It is, to me, what feels like actually the precursor to the Renaissance. Obviously, there's kind of you've got Oliver and Company and Rescuers Down Under, which kind of like affect the narrative of how that's going. But at number 29, it's The Great Mouse Detective, which is obviously a riff on a children's book, which is a riff on Sherlock Holmes. Again, we're back to England. We're back to slightly darker. We're back to big gay villains or gay queer-coded villains in these Disney movies, and it's one that isn't like a beloved one by you. So, Jerome, why don't you kick us off with this one?
I mean, I don't like it as much as you, but it is 35 on my list. So we are at a stage where we're definitely way above the bottom tier. And I don't know. I guess I wanted something more from this movie. I'm not saying it had to be longer. I just think I just think it's like it's super fun. I'm going to say the word inconsequential, but I don't want it to sound like an insult because I don't. That's not my intention. I just think that this is another movie that feels like, oh, this could have been a Disney afternoon TV show. Like you could have had the Great Mouse Detective as a character solving cases on a weekly basis, and that's how the movie comes across. And I think I would have really appreciated that. I think this movie is it's very watchable. It is it's very easy to watch. I think that's what I would say. I mean, 74 minutes. Again, you're in and out. I think there's some really fun elements to this movie. I don't know. I guess I wanted something more from it, and I can't quite pinpoint what that is. But I will say Vincent Price, very innocent. He is another great villain performance.
Oh no, I think he's absolutely tremendous in this movie. Yeah, and I'm just wondering whether or not, again, the context of how I'm watching this, because this was actually the movie I started my Disney watch on when I did it a couple of years ago, where because we started it in tandem with Blank Check covering Master and Clements, so therefore this is their first movie, and we kind of like ran through theirs, and then we circle back to the very beginning. So I'm not viewing it as inconsequential, like not in a negative way that you said, but obviously to me it's like this is actually a consequential movie because it's this kickoff for the guys who are going to be kind of like very key figures in the next 20-30 years worth of Disney animation history, and building the structure around it. So like seeing it in the context of that career maybe kind of like boosts it from that inconsequential feeling to maybe not like consequential, but definitely feeling like, oh, this is a new and refreshing thing that they can build from this point onwards. And again, like maybe it's also coming from the fact that like you just enjoy Black Cauldron more than I do, and so therefore all of this kind of like era, like it's the Disney Dark Ages in a lot of ways, but also like everyone's kind of picking up different movies from this decade to kind of like elevate that slight bit into like not the top tier, but that kind of like comfortable middle tier.
See, part of me wonders if we are just going back full circle because it feels like in the 80s you have all these big franchises, all these big horror movies, and people are excited about those, and Disney's got a new movie, and oh, we're kind of rolling our eyes because it's the Dark Ages. And I don't know, I'm not going to say we are in the Dark Ages per se, because a movie like Inside Out 2 just was very, very successful, made over $1 billion. So we're not in the Dark Ages. But with Disney specifically, I'm thinking about the last couple of years, and I mean, we might be there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, it doesn't feel as bleak as the 80s or the mid 2000s, but it definitely feels like there's a complacency, and it's the problem that Marvel's had of Marvel and Disney in general of like they're making bland movies. They're kind of like, again, they're shaving the edges off. They're not letting them be spiky and weird. And then when they are spiky and weird, you end up with like trolls lambasting them on the internet. So it's like, do you want a Last Jedi or a Turning Red? Movies which are like very obviously a creator's vision, and then you have like the next Star Wars movie is a complete repudiation of like what Last Jedi was doing, and then you've got the head of Pixar coming out saying like Luca and Turning Red are like not what we need to do. We need to be making more Inside Out 2s, which are like for a broad audience. I'm like, no, the things you need to be doing are like those specifics made by an artist, like driving these forward. And yeah, like we're in a similar age to those kind of like bleak points of Disney history, but coming it from it's not that the quality is bad, it's that the quality is basically irrelevant.
We have our formula, we have the things that we need to check off, and we are going to check those things off. And some cases are going to be successful, and in some cases they're not. Inside Out 2 was, of course, very successful, but part of the reason it was successful is because Inside Out is so beloved by people. And I'd be very curious if they do make an Inside Out 3, is that one going to be as successful as number 2? But we digress. Let's talk about more talking animals.
Yes. Talking animals indeed with our next one, which is kind of like both of us have got this in a very similar spot. I think I'm slightly lower on than you. Number 28, we have Zootopia or Zootropolis, depending on where you exist in the world.
Wait,
for this
it,
one,
it has a Zootropolis?
yes.
Tell me more about this.
It's cool. I think there was a movie, or there's a I think there's a zoo or an animal shelter or something in the UK that is called Zootopia, and it prevented the name from being Zootropolis in, or Zootopia in kind of UK or Europe or whatever. Yeah, due to trademark issues, the film is titled Zootropolis in various regions such as the UK, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. So there's obviously some European company that kind of like took over it. And then in Germany, it's called Zoomania. So there you go.
The more you know.
The more you know. Yeah, so this is one of those ones where, like, I think I've defaulted to calling it Zootopia because obviously it's the American name. It's the default when you see it talked about. But there are definitely times where I have to like code switch into like UK talking about this movie and be like, oh yeah, Zootropolis and whatnot. But yeah, so it's a very interesting one. But this is possibly the wildest movie that we're going to be discussing this week, because I think this movie is like the closest one to being like a masterpiece. It just bungles the race metaphor like in kind of a spectacular fashion. Like it's genuine.
It's kind of impressive, honestly.
Like it's just like when you just go through it step by step and go like, right, so in this world, the police are mostly made up of the minority people. The minority people are prejudiced against, but also they're the ruling class. And because they're the ruling class, it also means that all of the people are scared of them because they can then go on to basically be brainwashed into eating the masses. It's just like, and again, like to have it be, yeah, the police force is run by the minority people, but they're prejudiced against by the wider population, is like to come out in 2016 as well is just a stunning kind of like, I understand you're trying to dumb this down and make it appeal to children and using metaphors from the adult not adult world, the and animal
to come
world
out in 2016 of all years too.
Yes. And I understand that it's very similar to Elemental, where it's like, I understand the central metaphor for this thing is trying to be like inclusive and kind of like showing all kinds of different kind of prejudice and whatnot in our society, but you very obviously haven't thought about the implications of what you are actually like one-to-oneing this to for more than 5 seconds.
The lead character is a really cute bunny.
No, we're not. No, we are not going on to that topic of conversation. We're not discussing the sexualization of Judy Hopps.
And what about the cute fox, voiced by Jason Bateman?
No, please.
Funny the cute fox.
Away from. I will allow it. I will allow it when we get to Robin Hood. I'm not allowing it for Zootopia.
This is where you draw the line, huh?
I'm drawing the line here mostly because it is like, she's wearing like athleisure in this movie. Like why is she so like sexualized?
I don't understand. We talk to the directors, man. I mean, look, Rich Moore left Disney to go work for John Lasseter. That's all I'm gonna say.
But yeah, like this movie is really solid as like a fun murder mystery type thing. There's like actual chemistry between the leads. There's all like positive things to say about it, but it is just ultimately one where like the thematic center of this movie is like a black hole that just kind of like keeps on kind of going like, think about me for more than 2 seconds and I'll ruin your experience of watching this movie.
I don't disagree with anything you've said. I mean, I think that you pretty much have nailed it. I think again, if you don't think about the ramifications of this movie at all, I think it works almost spectacularly. I mean, it is kind of amazing that this movie just bungles the metaphor so well, but it ultimately still is a good movie. It's wild that they're able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I attribute it to the fact that you have. I mean, I do think, again, for all their flaws, I think having really good directors who know what they're doing, having those really good performances. I mean, that's why this movie is not 62 on our list, because it's so well executed in terms of the plot and some of the humor. Think of the sloth scene.
Yeah, no, again, that's the thing, is that there's so much to recommend about this movie. There are people I know who don't think about the cultural or the social kind of like ramifications of what this movie is doing, and I'm happy for them. Honestly, I'd love to live in a world in which I'm not like pseudo intellectualizing kind of like a lot of these things. It's just the movie very much is inviting you to do that if you are like even like tangentially involved in kind of like seeing our world and our culture and whatnot.
For sure. More talking animals.
More talking animals, of course. Number 27, we have Jerome's number 12 of all movies, and my number 44, another VHS that I wore the hell out of. I believe it's my father's favorite Disney movie, The Fox and the Hound.
I am shocked that it is this low. This is another movie that is kind of a mess. This is coming after the vestiges of not just Walt Disney dying, but some of the animators leaving. I think that this is a movie that I don't think it feels as much of a mess as even Frozen 2. I don't know, man. Like, I saw this when I was a kid. This is one that I didn't necessarily wear a VHS copy of it like I did with one of the movies that we're going to be talking about very soon. But this is a movie that I've always just, every time I put it on, I've really consistently enjoyed, even though it's not perfect. I think the relationship between the Fox and the Hound just works out really well. I think there's a lot of sentimentality to it. I really like the voiceover. You kind of got like the last vestiges of the Disney voiceover people as well. I mean, even though this is kind of a new era, this feels like the end of the old era in so many ways. And before we go into those dark ages, so Ben, go ahead and piss on the movie now. Go ahead.
I don't want to piss on it because again, I agree. I do love the relationship between the Fox and the Hound, but there's a lot of other stuff in this movie, and I feel like it kind of in some ways distracts from kind of like what is actually a really, really solid core of the relationship between Todd and Copper. And again, you've got like Mickey Rooney and Kurt Russell in like very early Kurt Russell kind of like stage at this point, and or not very early, but obviously like it's like the end of his Disney tenure, isn't it? Like this is him just he's about to like end their contract of exclusivity, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really fascinating movie to talk about, just because there's so much going on behind the scenes and with so many people leaving, and then you end up with something that feels like there's just that tug trying to go in one direction, but it still feels like in some ways it's preserving the classical Disney method. And I think in terms of watching it with that appreciation, that makes it all the more interesting.
I mean,
but if you're just watching it as a movie, I think it's still enjoyable.
Isn't this is like basically the movie where like a lot of the new up and coming talents are getting are coming on board for this movie. Like this is like Tim Burton works on this movie, Brad Bird works on this movie, John Lasseter works on this movie, Don Bluth quits in the middle of this movie to go form a different production studio. I believe this is like the one where Tim Burton like had his wisdom teeth out and is walking around the Disney offices with like blood gushing out of his mouth and whatnot. Like it's a real this is kind of like a inflection point for the entire industry of animation. Again, like it's the end of one style, it's the birth of the kind of the new animators coming onto this. Like it's the start of actual competitor animation organizations that are going to start taking away kind of the top talent, rather than just being assumed if you do animation you will go work for Disney. And I think all of that stuff is just more interesting than what the movie ultimately ends up being. And again, I think it's solid. I think it's really lovely. I just wish it kind of like had that kind of like step up, that level change to it. I think of it very similarly to Sword in the Stone in terms of it's very vignette-y, with the passing of time and the passing of seasons.
And again, I think I like that one more than you. So it's just funny that I like the vignette movies more than you do, apparently.
But speaking of vignette movies, the most vignette movie that we could possibly be talking about, number 26, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. My number 18, your number 37. This is like the king of vignettes because it is literally two theatrical shorts and then one original short that is added onto the end of it to make a feature-length Winnie the Pooh movie. But like the shorts in this movie had previously been aired. With other movies and whatnot, but blessedly, much like all the Winnie the Pooh movies, this one's only 74 minutes long.
That's always the best part is when these movies are 75 minutes. We need to bring back 75-minute movies.
I was because Inside Out 2 is like, I know you're not a huge fan of it, but like that movie's like a really easy kind of like 95.
I really like the fact that it was 90. Believe me, I love the fact that it was 95 minutes.
But yeah, like this movie again, the explicit, like, these are three individual stories to me really work, whereas obviously for you, you're less like enamored with these ones. Obviously not saying that like you don't like it, because obviously it's still within your top kind of, well, it's 37, so obviously you like this one a chunk less than the 2011 Winnie the Pooh movie, whereas for me, I'm like, this is top 20. It's a 4-star movie. I think it's so charming. It's kind of a perfect encapsulation of everything I love about this like little sub franchise within the Disney wheelhouse. So many great songs, so many great kind of classic Disney voices. Obviously, the shorts are kind of made over a period of many years, where it's like 1966, 1968, and 1974 the way the three were made. But I'll let you run on this one now.
I really liked Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree. I think that is the best of the three shorts. I think it's the most amusing to me. Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day is okay. That's probably my least favorite. That's probably what's dragging this down. And then Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2, I really enjoy that one. So it's really Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day. That's the one that kind of bogs this and probably drags it down the list for me. But I do like the Winnie the Pooh and the Honey. I mean, that is the quintessential Winnie the Pooh story in my mind. Is that, I mean, that's the one that's been parodied to death.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I obviously I like all of these. The Blustery Day one is obviously the one where like Piglet has his house stolen, and it is deeply crushing to just watch this small pig get like completely walked over by everything else that's happening in it. But yeah, I think this is, maybe it is just I'm reacting far stronger to kind of like the 60s movies. I feel like you are in some ways, and this feels in conversation with that more than it does the stuff that's coming out in the 70s.
For sure. Another huge disagreement forthcoming. I am shocked at how much of a disparity there is with number 25.
Number 25, your number 40, my number 14. This is a movie that on rewatch, I turned to my partner and said, there's a lot more animal shit in this movie than I remember.
Which is why it's number 40. I just want to state that for the record.
The thing you forget about this movie, and the movie is of course Cinderella, is how much of this is basically just a cat chasing mice around the house. And to me, I'm just like, this is kind of like a little bit of an animation flex. It feels in conversation with like Tom and Jerry at points in terms of like what it's just trying to do with that. But yeah, this is very much kind of like the plot of Cinderella is like 30 minutes of this movie, and then there's like 60 minutes of like everything else, or like 50 minutes of everything else.
So obviously you enjoy the cat mouse antics, right?
I do.
I like them in pieces, but it's too much of the movie. I mean, that's ultimately why I don't think Cinderella is a classic. And I've heard that Cinderella 3 is apparently really good. Have you heard this?
I have heard this. When we finished the Disney movies, I was like, and we're going to roll on to the direct-to-video movies, and my partner was like, only if you want to like me to leave immediately. So I have not ventured down that well. I'm sure it would end up with me basically giving all of them this realm of like 1 to 2.5 stars, and then maybe there'll be a couple that are like the 3.5 stars. But like
Aladdin 3 and Cinderella 3, I've heard are. I mean, Aladdin 3 I actually think is pretty good.
I do not like any of the Aladdin sequels. I think they look very cheap. Obviously, Aladdin 3's got the benefit of Robin Williams coming back. It is better than Return of Jafar, but I'm not going to go into the
sure.
like pretty good.
Fair enough. But yeah, I think Cinderella, I mean, it's iconic. It's definitely got, you can, there's definitely some great moments of animation. But yeah, this movie is kind of a dud in my mind in terms of some of the, some of those elements like with the cat and the mouse. And, but I mean, again, there's some wonderful imagery, but it's just mixed in with some not so great stuff either. It's a weird movie.
It
Weird
is.
movie.
It's a deeply, deeply weird movie, and it's one that I kind of like appreciate for all of its weirdness in a lot of ways. It doesn't feel like it should be as weird as it is, but I guess it is also. This is the first feature that Disney do after they've kind of like kicked out the package movies of the late 1940s. So this is their like return to feature length animation, and it is so much weirder than like Bambi was 8 years previous to that.
Yes, for sure.
But there's not really much else to kind of say about that. So from number 25, Cinderella, let's move on to number 24, Peter Pan, which is basically a tie. You have it at 26, I have it at 27. This is like a quintessential Disney movie. Neither of us are like, this is great, but I think both of us are like pretty good, kind of like top of this like strata of Disney movies.
Every time I watch Peter Pan, I expect it to be higher on the list, and for some reason, there's something about it. Like I consistently enjoy it, but there's nothing about it that ever really elevates it. I don't know if it's the fact that there's a missing song or two. Is it some of the mild? I mean, do we want to call it mild racism, or do we just want to call it full out racism? What do we think?
I mean, I think it is full on racism, but it's one of those ones where it's like it's so deeply embedded in the cultural depiction at this point in time, where it's almost like someone could do it in this era and not even think twice about it. Like it's almost not on purpose, just because every single piece of media is telling the story in the exact same way. Uh,
Yeah, for
like
sure.
cowboys good, the natives bad, and it takes for 100 years from like, well, not even
Man,
obviously
oh
is it.
man, oh man. I mean, we're talking even into the 80s and 90s. I mean, you're still seeing that, and I'm sure in some cases you're. I mean, look, there's still sports teams in this country, professional sports teams that are named after indigenous cultures. I mean, the Cleveland Guardians were the Cleveland Indians just a couple of short years ago. So that just shows you that these things do not go away, and they just kind of linger. And this is an example of it. But I mean, Peter Pan is probably one of the most interpreted stories that we have in our culture at this point. We've seen so many. We saw there was a live action. Ben, I saw it. I know it exists. There is a live action Peter Pan that came out last year.
The Peter Pan and Wendy, directed by David Lowery.
Yes.
I thought you were going to go on the Hugh Jackman Peter Pan movie with Hugh Jackman as Hook, directed by Joe Wright. They like that's the thing is they keep getting interesting directors to do Peter Pan adaptations, and none of them hit. It is this bizarre. I mean, it obviously like such an iconic story, and this is
I
probably
mean, look
the
at what
most.
Hook did to Steven Spielberg, for God's sakes.
Well, yeah, that's the thing is like Steven Spielberg's done Hook, Joe Wright's done a Pan movie, David Lowery's done a Pan movie, and obviously I wouldn't say that Lowery's on the same level as even Joe Wright on the consistency basis, but he's a director I really really like. But yeah, like the Peter Pan is like an iconic piece of culture. This is probably the definitive telling of this story. I don't think there is another one that kind of like comes close. I know some people really like the kind of the mid 2000s Pan movie or Peter Pan movie. But they tend to be people who kind of like grew up with that one as the telling. Did you? It's also a really interesting one in terms of just its history, in terms of adaptation, in that the rights were held by a children's hospital, and so it never ended up in the public domain in a way that other stuff should be, because the rights were like kept alive by having the exclusivity to this hospital in that way. So they were like selective, I guess you would say, in terms of like who they would hand out the rights to, and so you'd quite often get people coming up with alternative tellings of this story and then kind of having to shy away from it. Like there was the Peter Pan serial killer movie that would come up where like Captain Hook was a police detective and Peter Pan was a child murderer and whatnot. Like you've got all these people trying to subvert
I
the
mean, do you
story.
really need that? I don't know, man. Like,
I'm not saying we do, but it's just it's there's an interesting cultural history to this movie or to this story, and this movie is kind of the definitive version of it, in a way that I think makes people like a little bit crazy in terms of subverting it in some ways.
I mean, I think it's a really hard story to subvert. If I think the thing is that the fact that a children's hospital owns it makes it very different than if it was like a corporation or something. So I definitely understand where they're coming from in terms of trying to protect the story, probably more so than even if an individual was doing it. So I just think that this is a story that has been told many times, and it probably has never been told and will never be told. I mean, the idea of the story on the surface is kind of creepy, just in
Mm,
terms of who Peter Pan is. So I think that's part of the issue. And I think when you're talking about casting children in live action, casting children even in animation, I think that is a difficult challenge. Hook is a great character. That's why I think Steven Spielberg kind of latched onto Hook and making the movie, at least in terms of the title, Hook instead of Peter Pan. So I think that is a great villain. I think that his moment and the feud with the alligator. I mean, that's what people remember. But Peter Pan as a character, I just don't know how interesting he can be, which is why you end up with Robin Williams as Peter Pan all those years later. So I just think that it's a really challenging story to adapt, and that's why it's been failed upon so many times. And I think this is the most successful version because I think keeping it as kind of a children's story is for the best.
yes, absolutely. Moving on, we threatened you with this earlier on. We're back to talking animals. We're back to the sexual awakening for many, 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 many women. We are, of course, talking about Robin Hood, the
Just
sexiest cop in
women.
Fox movie.
I mean, what about Maid Marian, Ben?
I know, but I feel like it's far more common for women to be like, yeah, that Robin Hood. Even both of them are hot, but I feel like there's enough debauched men that are open about their love of cartoon animals on the internet. But Robin Hood, for whatever reason, is the like
That's fair.
one where women will be like, no, specifically Robin Hood. They're not going to be creating weird TikTok fan accounts of Judy Hopps and whatnot. God, what a cursed society that we live in. But yeah, Robin Hood. Weirdly, like when we're talking about Peter Pan, and obviously like that is the definitive version. Robin Hood, we both have it kind of like similar spots, about 13 points different. It's in your top 20, it's my 33. Robin Hood, this is not the definitive version of Robin Hood, I would say. I think it is an iconic version, but I think there are far like this one is one that is done every 5 to 10 years. Someone else takes a shot at this
And it's
story.
done mostly again a story that's been done to death, mostly poorly. The Errol Flynn version for me is the best version of the story.
You're not a fan of Prince of Thieves?
No, I am not a fan of Kevin Costner's interpretation. At least it wasn't 3 hours long.
You're not a fan of Ridley Scott's interpretation?
Oh God. Oh God. Why? Why would you bring that up? Why would you bring that out of mothballs?
Because we have to talk about. I mean, are you a fan of Mel Brooks's version of this movie?
I mean, that's probably the second or third best one.
And then, I mean, I'm now really going to be digging into the mothballs on this one. What about Otto Bathurst's version with Taron Egerton as Robin Hood?
I remember seeing that trailer. It's like, this is cursed. I mean, it just looks cursed. Also, a movie that I don't believe exists.
It's got Jamie Foxx and Ben Mendelsohn in it. Those are two guys that definitely don't do projects that don't exist.
I think Jamie Foxx is one of those people who would show up for the opening of an envelope if you paid him enough.
Yes.
And that's
Weirdly,
not. I mean, look, you got to pay bills, man. But
well, Jamie Foxx, Ben Mendelsohn, two guys who I'm like generally a fan of. It's just they are both guys who do not have like a give a shit about the quality of the projects that they do, but they will be good in the projects that if the movie is bad.
So in rewatching, I'm going to get us back on track here. So this is a movie that I saw a ton when I was a kid. This is a movie that I definitely wore the VHS out. So, which is really odd because this movie came out in 1973. I was born in '85. It's weird that this movie I latched onto so much, but you look at some of the themes of the movie and being anti-capitalism, and I think my viewpoints on that issue was formed through this movie. This movie also gets really dark. I was surprised to be watching it just how dark it got by like showing them in chains and in prisons and stuff. Like this movie goes pretty hard.
It does. I mean, it's kind of vaguely bleak. I mean, obviously, you've got like we love Robin Hood. Like, there's all kinds of iconic scenes. There's the sucking the jewels off of the rings. That like it's really fun. But there's bits of it where this is very obviously in that era where they're cutting down on costs, and you've got things with what's the snake called in this movie? But like the snake character is so obviously like a trace job of the snake in Jungle Book, and
I mean, there are multiple characters that are a ripoff of the Jungle Book for sure.
Yeah, it's very much, and I'm not, again, it's not a bad thing. It's just very obvious. Sir Hiss. And then I think like even Bedknobs and Broomsticks is one that I weirdly kind of like conflate with this movie, because obviously that's got the kind of is it the rugby scene or football scene where they're kind of like playing a ball game in that movie, and all of the animal characters feel like something out of Robin Hood. And yeah, it's just it's an era for cheaper animation but not necessarily stylized animation, which we'll see in a movie kind of like a lot higher up this list. It's good, it's nice, but it does feel like it's kind of a signal for where Disney are going to be in a few years, where like they're not adding enough to the telling of this story to make it like really sing. It's just a kind of rock solid meat and potatoes adaptation of Robin Hood with like some really compelling moments. Again, this has got the one of the biggest earworms in the entire Disney catalog, is kind of the opening song to this movie.
Can you whistle that opening song for us?
I know I don't want to blow out the mic out, but like the
it's iconic. I mean, it's probably the most memorable part of the movie is the opening theme. It's pretty great.
Yeah, all right, I mean, it's great, but Jerome, why? Why? I mean,
this is the greatest disparity.
Inevitably, it had to happen. But like this is the only one. So every other movie in both of our top 10s is in the top 20. In fact, yes. I think every movie in both of our top 10s is in the top 10, apart from one, apart from two, and even then it's at number 13 is the only other kind of.
There's one movie that I have at 11 that you have at 6, but I mean that's not a huge. Or you have it at number 2. I'm sorry.
Yes, but like that's the thing is I'm looking at kind of like the top 10 of this list is basically broadly like the combination of our top 10s. Oh no, and there's number 12 and number 13 are movies which are like just slightly outside of my top of your in your top 10, but outside of the overall top 10. But regardless, this is my number 7, and your number 45.
And it is Lilo and Stitch.
You have put this in the like bottom third of the list.
I have never been a fan. I've seen this movie 3 times, and I've gone in with an open mind every time. I don't like the look of the movie. I think that's the thing that's really holding me back. Is I just think the movie doesn't look good, and a huge part of Disney animation for me is that the movie has to look good. I like the sisterly relationship. I think that is the strongest attribute of the movie. So when I say I don't like this movie, I want that to be very clear. Is that I still think there are some elements to it that work, but I don't know. I mean, this movie, just the plot and the look of it, it is never fully formed in my head that this was good. And yeah, I mean, this is a tough one because I know you really like this one. This to me feels like how old were you when this came out?
About 10 probably.
If I saw this when I was 10 years old, I'm going to guess that it would be higher in my list.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree this movie does look cheap. Obviously there's a story for that, which is this was made by a secondary studio. It was like a studio formed to exist within a Disney park. It was designed to give you a tour of a working animation studio. They made that movie there. It is not the kind of the regular Disney animation studio. It obviously had production problems. It was in production in the middle of 9/11, and there was a sequence in which Stitch hijacks a plane and flies it through a city on Hawaii, and so they had to change it. And you can see the kind of the animation differences between that scene where they turn the plane into an alien spaceship and they turn the city into a mountain range. It is actually a testament that this movie came out less than a year later, or maybe a little bit more than a year after 9/11. In fact, it's 6 months after 9/11, or 9 months after 9/11. I think this is maybe the most emotionally mature movie that Disney have ever made. I think it is incredibly affecting in ways that I think are really underrated. It's the kind of thing where, like, if to me, all of the movies that they made in the 2010s where they stripped away the villains and they're trying to go for something that's more thematically resonant are trying to reach the highs of Lilo and Stitch in terms of exactly what that is. I think there's a confidence in this movie to make Lilo like actually a little bit unpleasant early on in the movie. Like, she is definitely not kind of like, quite often in Disney movies, like the central kid is like good as gold and everything like that, and Lilo is obviously like very troubled by the backstory for it. I think it is also benefited from the fact that, like, there's not that much star power in this movie, and Disney has been guilty of doing that in either side of this, where they're not to the level that DreamWorks will get to, but definitely putting name actors in kind of like very prominent roles into these movies, whereas like when this movie, like the biggest name you can think of is like David Ogden Stiers and Ving Rhames. It's a very different level to even that we were discussing earlier on this episode with Emperor's New Groove, with the kind of people. They're all on kind of like top 10 sitcoms when that movie is coming out, or have just left top 10 sitcoms that are on television. And yeah, I think that's why I just absolutely adore this movie, just for the emotional maturity, for the thematic relevance of it, for having the confidence to be just pricklier than Disney movies tend to be. Yeah, like to me, this is kind of like, this is the kind of movie that I wish they learned from and pivoted into in the 2000s, and instead they pivot into bad movies from this point onwards. But this one to me is like a shining light and the best. I think this is the best movie they've done since the end of the Renaissance, in all honesty.
I would say that I don't disagree that I think they could have taken some lessons from this movie and built upon them and done something a lot better. I certainly agree with that. I think for me, this is the type of movie I don't want to see a live action remake. I would like to see a different version of this movie with a little bit more heft behind it, and not necessarily making the movie longer, but just to see what another interpretation might look like, and maybe I would appreciate that more. Again, I do think that there are some elements of this movie that are good. I mean, this is not Chicken Little. This is not nearly at that level, but this to me never really elevated beyond kind of the lower mid tier in terms of, it just felt like there was something missing. And I'm not saying that there had to be songs, because if so many people have mentioned, they didn't have time for songs because they need to live and they need to exist, right, Ben?
I mean, there's Elvis. Elvis is there to cover the gap, and who doesn't love Elvis? As a musician, not necessarily as a person.
Yeah, you need to qualify that statement. And yeah, we don't need to go there. Just watch Priscilla, everyone. Watch Priscilla.
Good movie.
But yeah,
I feel bad that this, like, I feel like that speech I made for why I love this movie should be in the end of this episode. But sadly, there's a movie at number 21 that we will discuss to close out this.
It's an awkward way to end it, because we are in agreement on our final movie for the most part.
We are, and it is a movie which I think is like pretty solid and kind of like an upper tier version of what they've been doing the last 10 years. Number 21 is Wreck-It Ralph, a movie that most people call a video game movie, but it isn't a video game movie. It's really a candy movie. Because boy, does this movie pivot hard into like away from the video game references about like 40 minutes in.
Yeah, it's but I think that's a good thing. Like, I feel like the problem with Wreck-It Ralph 2 is that it just luxuriated in IP, and this movie actually tells a story. And for me, that's the difference between Wreck-It Ralph 1 and Wreck-It Ralph 2. That's why this movie works so much better, because it gets away from the references and focuses on the characters. And again, I think the casting of Wreck-It Ralph, that's why, and the reason that number 2 isn't terrible is because you did make two really good casting choices. John C. Riley playing, of course, the playing Ralph, and Sarah Silverman as Penelope. So the fact that you get those two casting decisions, I mean, that's going to do a lot for your movie, and not to mention the fact that you have, Alan Tudyk has been in so many of these Disney movies, playing King Candy. It's just, I mean, just looking across the board, some really, really good casting choices. And yeah, that's really all I could say. It's just a super fun movie. Like, I don't think that it's necessarily in the top tier, but it is definitely a movie that is very consistent, and again, doesn't focus nearly as much on the references as the sequel does.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not even asking for the references, because obviously the second movie is all internet-based humor and kind of like playing off of like a very different set of kind of reference points. This one, whereas this one is nominally kind of like an arcade movie, and you start with like lots of very explicit references. Like, it's, look, we're going to do Donkey Kong is going to be kind of like the main in like reference point for kind of this thing, but we're not going to do actual Donkey Kong. We're going to make our own IP from this, and the video game references will be like minor and kind of like sprinkled in the early portion of the movie. It's the thing that kind of like maybe holds it back from being great is it promises it's going to be one thing, and then it pivots into a really, really good and solid character piece, and as you say, like impeccably well acted by John C. Riley and Sarah Silverman. um but you just kind of feel like they've had all these ideas, like they're doing the Halo riff, they're playing with these old arcade games that no one realizes, they move into a Mario Kart riff, and then the movie kind of like grinds to a halt to do lots of food puns, and it's fine, they're funny, I enjoy the candy world. It definitely isn't like a death knell. The movie is still fun, but I'm almost like, oh, wouldn't it have been great for them to kind of like doing these races through multiple different arcade games, like they're you're still playing with the kind of the world of the arcade, and not necessarily referencing IP, but referencing other genres of video game, and playing around with what you could do with that. But like the actual story, obviously this is where it has Tudyk done. The Frozen's the next year, isn't it, or is this the year after? I always forget which one of these comes first.
I believe it's Frozen that comes first. Let's double check the. No, Wreck-It Ralph is 2012. Frozen is the next year, 2013.
Yeah, so this is when Tudyk becomes the kind of the mascot of the entire company, and you can tell like his performance is so good in this as King Candy and as the villain. Again, this is probably the last time that these movies have had an actual villain who is villainous.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely feels like it's one of the last times. I mean, Frozen does have a villain as well, but yeah, we don't really get a lot of villains after
But
this.
there's no villain song in Frozen. Like the last villain song is Princess and the Frog, and this is the last time with like kind of like a maniacal, we need to actually like defeat the villains kind of in the movie, whereas Frozen is just the bit of a wet blanket in terms of like how they ultimately end that one. It's not like they have to the final inflection point in the movie is not we need to get rid of the villain, it's Anna and Elsa need to make up. um we're talking so much about Frozen. Like Frozen is like truly hanging over like almost all of Disney over the last kind of like
It
10 years,
is.
and even a
I mean,
movie
in
that
some
came out
ways they
before
have
it.
not. In some ways, they made that movie, and they have seemingly been trying to recapture the magic of it since. It's really unusual, and I think again part of the issue is that this is just what Disney does. They find something that works, and they just want to kind of recapture the old magic, and you can't do that. I feel like the MCU is kind of going through some of the same growing pains. Star Wars very clearly is going through it, and I think it's something that Disney is going to have to figure out. And I don't know how they do that.
Yeah, it's a weird point for this company, and I mean, by the time we record part 3, we won't have seen Moana 2, will we? Or will we have just?
No, I think and let me see. I believe we are going. So this episode is coming out in July. Our final episode in terms of this series is going to be in October. So we will come back in October with part 3.
Yep. So we will not be able to discuss Moana 2 in any way, shape, or form. So it's fine. It's good. We've actually managed to time this really, really well. I think that's all we have to say about all of these movies. Hopefully, we haven't pissed off too many people. I feel like we've done these movies like a solid service, and it hasn't been as contentious as we thought it was going to be.
I mean,
And
I think
then,
that for me, the thing is that I don't hate Lilo and Stitch. Like, if you had Chicken Little number 7 on your list and I had it number 45, then we would fight. But I just don't feel like these movies are necessarily bad. Like, even the movies that are at 45, I still think they're good.
right, yeah, that's the thing. Is ultimately it's a and next time is basically going to be, I think we're basically in kind of like lockstep for a lot of these. There'll be like obviously disagreements in terms of like how high
There's big
things need to
disagreement
go.
at number 20, but then after that, it's pretty much beloved movies from there.
Yeah, you almost wish we kind of had like Wreck-It Ralph at number 20 just so we could finish this on like a contentious one. But alas, the math only barely, like if we'd actually run this list with like true averages, like Wreck-It Ralph and our number 20 movie would have been exactly tied, but I needed to figure out some way to kind of like break up the tie breaks.
That's pretty amazing. That is pretty remarkable. But yeah, we have talked about 42 Disney movies at this point, and I mean we're talking about some of the all-time greats from here on. I don't think a lot of them are going to be too big of a surprise, but especially in the teens here, we may get a surprise or two.
I mean, you should know what this is going to be, and hopefully it will all slot into place, and you'll realize that actually we did create the definitive Disney list, and there's no problems with it whatsoever.
I mean, Chicken Little absolutely is number 62. I don't. There is no debate, no argument that needs to be had.
No, absolutely not.
Ben, do you want to plug anything before we head out?
I'm not doing anything. Like, I genuinely, like I said, I think earlier on this year, I said I was going to write some stuff, and I just haven't got round to writing anything.
Your business, they're personal things.
Yes, very lots of stuff going on in my personal life. Like we're kind of like broadly taking this year off. I can say that one Matt Waters and Mike Thomas are coming back to do some podcasting. I think either it will have happened in July or it's happening kind of like in a few weeks time and stuff like that. But they're doing some stuff to tie in with Deadpool and Wolverine. If you're interested in kind of the old haunt of the real world in terms of that stuff, you can always follow me on Letterboxd at Nquoid, Nquoid. I'm still trucking through kind of like 2000s movies, although if you look at my Letterboxd recently, you will see it being lots of Godzilla. And then you will see like Grease and The Place Beyond the Pines and Notebook, which is because I let my fiance basically pick all our movies for 1 week. So she was basically like, we're watching my favorite movies for a whole week. But other than that, yeah, watching a lot of 2000s movies, watching lots of Kevin Costner, watching David Lynch, but not actually producing any content.
What do they have in common?
He likes a Western, that man. And they're also very long. It's not his best movie is 40 minutes less than 3 hours, and I do not think it's a coincidence that it's his best movie.
Of course, you can continue to follow us on here at From the Queue, the non-content podcast. Brian will be back next week. Ben, what do you think about this doubleheader? We will be discussing Team America celebrating the 20th anniversary and Dick celebrating the 25th anniversary.
See, I think you've fucked up here. You should be doing Team America and Thunderbirds.
Possibly, but we're doing an America theme. And we are doing Dr. Strangelove as well coming up. So, 60th anniversary.
Team America and Thunderbirds both celebrating their 20th anniversary. And I mean, I think is it an Americanized version of... No, it's French. The French funded Thunderbirds, although Jonathan Frakes was the director. But Don't know why I'm thinking about Thunderbirds at the moment. This is the second time this week I've had the conversation around Thunderbirds and Team America. I think it's because Busted performed recently at a UK festival and told the story of how they were promised that they would be as big as Celine Dion with Titanic for their song they wrote for the Thunderbirds movie, and that did not happen.
It's no, it did not. It did not. But yes, please continue to subscribe. Leave those 4 or 5-star reviews. For Ben, I'm Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week.
Thank you.